By the winter of 1846, Daniel Prescott understood that Thornhill was not merely a plantation with secrets. It was a system refined through generations. The routines never changed. Selection, isolation, silence. The efficiency of it disturbed him more than any single act of cruelty. Cruelty at least implied impulse. What Prescott witnessed was planning. The first real break in his detachment came with a girl named Mary. She was no more than 16 when she was moved to the cottage. Prescott remembered approving the transfer order without reading it carefully. Just another name among many. 6 months later, he saw her again, standing near the physician's wagon, her hands trembling as she clutched a blanket far too small to hide what had been taken from her. When she noticed Prescott watching, her eyes did not plead, they accused. That night, Prescott opened the plantation ledgers he was officially forbidden to alter. Births were recorded, yes, but selectively. Some entries ended abruptly. Others never appeared at all. He realized then that the courthouse records Hayes would one day examine were only half the truth. Thornhill kept two histories, one public, one private. In Savannah, Rebecca Hartwell reached a similar conclusion. Her private ledger now contained 9 confirmed cases from Thornhill, spread across 5 counties. She noticed something else as well. The buyers were often men with political connections, judges, sheriffs, influential planters, men unlikely to be questioned. The children were being absorbed into power itself. Rebecca began copying documents at night, careful not to remove originals. She hid the copies in a false bottom of her travel trunk. Each page felt dangerous. Each name felt like a promise she might not live long enough to keep. Clark. Thomas Hayes, meanwhile, made a decision he had delayed for years. He began duplicating his private ledger, writing a second copy in smaller script, coded, disguised as tax annotations. If one was discovered, the other might survive. He mailed fragments anonymously to an abolitionist printer in Philadelphia, unsigned, unexplained. He did not know if they would be believed. He only knew that silence had already lasted too long. The 3 of them moved cautiously, unknowingly in parallel. None imagined justice would come quickly. None believed they would be heroes. They acted instead from a quieter impulse, the refusal to let the truth vanish completely. Thornhill Plantation entered 1847 prosperous and unchallenged. Cotton yields were high. Edmund Marlowe spoke openly of expanding operations. Another cottage was discussed, another generation prepared to inherit. But the system had grown too large, too patterned, too documented. It had produced records, witnesses, and memories it could no longer fully erase. The spring of 1847 brought visitors to Thornhill Plantation, the kind Edmund Marlowe welcomed. Men of standing, investors, distant relatives, and politicians escaping the damp air of Savannah. The house filled with laughter, fine meals, and talk of cotton prices and westward expansion. To outsiders, Thornhill appeared flawless, a model of Southern prosperity. Daniel Prescott watched these gatherings from a distance. He noticed how certain guests were shown only selected parts of the estate. The gardens, the library, the stables. Never the quarters beyond a polite glance. Never the cottage. When one guest, drunk on brandy and confidence, wandered too far one evening, Prescott was ordered to escort him back personally. No explanation given. None required. That same week, a child disappeared. The boy had been born to a woman named Ruth, one of the few who had survived 2 confinements in the cottage. Prescott remembered seeing the child once, briefly, carried by a house servant across the yard at dawn. Pale hair, light eyes, wrapped tightly, as if concealment were part of his care. By nightfall, the boy was gone. No sale notice, no record in the overseer's books. Only a single line added later in Marlowe's private ledger. Transferred. Prescott understood then that not all children were sold. Some were placed, hidden within other households, raised elsewhere under new names. The realization made his stomach turn. Thornhill was not merely profiting from silence, it was exporting it. In Savannah, Rebecca Hartwell received an unexpected visitor. A clerk from McIntosh County, a man she recognized from prior auctions. He spoke carefully, as if every word were weighed. He asked whether she had noticed anything unusual about certain consignments from Thornhill. Rebecca felt the room tighten around her. She answered cautiously, neither confirming nor denying. Before leaving, the man slipped her a folded note. Inside was a single sentence. "You are not the only one keeping records." That night, Rebecca did not sleep. She reorganized her papers, separating dates from names, names from locations. If her work were discovered, it would ruin her uncle, perhaps end her life. Yet stopping now felt impossible. She had crossed the line where ignorance was no longer available. Clark Thomas Hayes, too, felt the pressure closing in. Someone had been in the courthouse basement. Nothing was taken, but files were out of order, drawers left slightly ajar. A warning, subtle but unmistakable. He moved his smaller ledger from his house to a hiding place beneath the floorboards of a disused carriage shed. He burned several drafts of letters he had never sent. Each of them sensed it. The balance was shifting. Thornhill could continue only so long as its secrecy held. But secrecy requires perfect silence, and people are imperfect. Clerks notice patterns. Overseers observe routines. Auction houses remember faces. Records accumulate. By the end of that year, there would be whispers, not public accusations, not yet, but questions. Quiet ones, asked behind closed doors. Why Thornhill? Why so many children? Why always young? Why always far away? The answers would not come easily. Some would be buried. Some would be denied. But enough would remain. Enough to ensure that Thornhill Plantation, so carefully designed to erase its victims, would one day be remembered not for its columns or its cotton, but for the truth it tried and failed to hide. The first inquiry did not arrive with warrants or speeches. It came quietly, disguised as routine bureaucracy. In October of 1847, a letter reached the Chatham County Courthouse, requesting clarification on several birth and transfer discrepancies tied to properties south of Savannah. The request was unsigned, routed through a tax office in Milledgeville, and framed as a matter of accounting. But Clark Thomas Hayes recognized it immediately for what it was. Someone else had followed the trail. Hayes answered carefully. He provided only what was explicitly asked for, nothing more, nothing less. Dates, registration numbers, transfer confirmations, all correct, all legal. But even within those narrow limits, the pattern could not be fully concealed. He copied the response twice, one version sent, the other sealed and hidden, then with his ledgers. Word of the inquiry reached Thornhill within days. Edmund Marlowe did not panic. He had weathered questions before. He summoned Daniel Prescott to the main house, offered him brandy, spoke casually about profits and expansion. Then, without changing his tone, he asked Prescott whether he had noticed any unusual attention from officials. Prescott chose his words with care. "No more than usual, sir." Marlowe studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Thornhill runs on order. Disorder attracts curiosity." Within a week, 2 women were moved out of the cottage and sold immediately, younger than usual. Documentation rushed. The cottage stood empty for the first time in years. Not closed, paused. In Savannah, Rebecca Hartwell felt the shift before she could explain it. Auctions involving Thornhill consignments stopped entirely. No notices, no explanations. When she asked her uncle, he only shook his head. "Someone up the chain wants quiet." Then one evening, as she returned home, Rebecca noticed a man standing at pistol remained. Her ledger did not. Panic rose in her throat, then hardened into resolve. She still had the copies. Weeks later, the inquiry stalled. Officially, it ended due to insufficient cause. No wrongdoing found, no further action required. The system protected itself, as it always had, but damage had been done. Hayes continued his work in silence, knowing he would never see justice in his lifetime. Prescott crossed the street. He did not follow her. He did not speak. He simply watched. The next night, he was there again. On the third night, he was gone, but her desk drawer had been disturbed. Her resigned his position the following spring, citing health reasons. He left Georgia entirely, carrying memories he could never unlearn. Rebecca married shortly after, moved north, and took her documents with her, sealed and preserved. Thornhill Plantation survived the decade. It survived scrutiny. It survived rumor. It did not survive time. When the war came years later, Thornhill's fields fell silent. The cottage decayed. Ledgers were abandoned, burned, lost, or forgotten in basements. And when historians finally began to piece together the fragments, they did not find a single villain or a single act, but a system, methodical, legal, and monstrous. What Thornhill proved was not merely that cruelty existed, but that it could be organized, justified, and hidden in plain sight. And that even then it left evidence. The records sat in the basement of the Chatham County Courthouse for 113 years before anyone thought to examine them closely. Tax assessments, birth registries, property transfers, the ordinary paperwork of a society built on human bondage. But buried in those yellowing ledgers was a pattern so disturbing that when Clark Thomas Hayes first noticed it in 1847, he stopped writing mid-sentence, his pen trembling above the page. 11 children, all documented as enslaved, all described with the same peculiar notation: light complexion, European features, questionable origin, all had come from Thornhill Plantation. Hayes had been recording slave births and transfers for nearly 2 decades. He'd seen every variation the brutal arithmetic of slavery could produce, the children of mixed unions, the gradations of skin tone that determined a person's value at auction, the careful documentation that reduced human beings to livestock. But this was different. These children weren't listed as mulatto or quadroon, the term slaveholders used to categorize those of mixed African and European ancestry. The descriptions were more specific, more troubling. Hair straight, brown, eyes blue, grey, skin white, freckled, features entirely Caucasian in appearance, and every single entry traced back to the same place. A cotton plantation 15 miles south of Savannah, owned by the Marlowe family for 3 generations. Hayes closed the ledger and didn't speak of it to anyone. Some things he'd learned were safer left unexamined in Georgia in 1847. But he couldn't stop thinking about those children. Couldn't stop wondering what was happening behind the gates of Thornhill Plantation that would produce such a consistent, impossible pattern. He wasn't the only one who'd noticed. Thomas Hayes had never intended to become a keeper of secrets. He'd taken the courthouse clear position in 1829, fresh from a failed attempt at running a general store in Augusta. The work was tedious but steady, recording births, deaths, property transfers, tax assessments. In a county where human beings were bought and sold like cattle, most of the paperwork involved slavery in some form. Over the years, Hayes had developed a particular system for organizing records. He cross-referenced birth registries with property transfers, tracked family lineages, noted patterns in estate management. It was partly professional pride, partly a way to make sense of the overwhelming volume of documentation that passed through his hands. He'd created his own filing system, indexed by a plantation name that allowed him to trace the movement of enslaved people across Chatham County with unusual precision. It was this system that revealed the pattern. On a humid afternoon in July 1847, while reorganizing files damaged by a roof leak, Hayes pulled records for Thornhill Plantation to verify some tax documentation. As he laid out the birth registries chronologically, something caught his attention. The first entry was from 1831. Female child born to Hannah. Enslaved, light-kinned, unusual features. Sold at 6 months old to a plantation in McIntosh County. Then 1833. Male child born to Patience, enslaved. Pale complexion, straight hair, blue eyes. Sold at 8 months to an estate in Glenn County, 1835. Female child born to Rebecca, enslaved, white-skinned, European features, sold at 1 year to a planter in Liberty County. The entries continued, spaced roughly 18 to 24 months apart, each describing children who seemed impossible given their mother's documented descriptions. And every child was sold within the first year of life, always to distant plantations, always with the notation from Thornhill Estate. Hayes spread 15 years of birth records across his desk, his hands shaking slightly as the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't the random occurrence of mixed-race children, which happened on many plantations. This was systematic, regular, deliberate. He thought about taking the records to his supervisor, then reconsidered. Judge Warren Pembroke, owned 3 plantations himself and was known to socialize with Edmund Marlowe. Hayes thought about the sheriff, then remembered that Sheriff Dixon had purchased 2 young slaves from Thornhill just last year. Everyone was connected. Everyone had interests to protect. Hayes carefully returned the records to their proper places, but he kept his own private notation, a small ledger he maintained at home, where he documented what he'd found. He told himself he was just keeping accurate records, doing his job thoroughly. But late at night, alone in his modest house on the edge of Savannah, he would open that ledger and stare at the entries, trying to reconcile what they implied with the world he lived in. 11 children documented clearly. But as he continued his research in the following weeks, being careful not to draw attention to his interest, he found references to 6 more, their documentation less clear, but following the same pattern. 17 children total sold from Thornhill Plantation between 1831 and 1847. And those were only the ones who'd survived to be sold. The burial records told another story. Rebecca Hartwell had spent 4 years working as a clear for her uncle's auction house in Savannah. It was considered unseemly for a woman to be involved in such business. But her uncle Edward was elderly and needed help with the records. His eyesight was failing, his hands trembled when he wrote, and the business required meticulous documentation to avoid legal disputes. Rebecca had a gift for numbers and an ability to remain composed even during the most disturbing sales. She taught herself to see past the human tragedy unfolding on the auction block, to focus only on the figures in her ledger. It was a survival mechanism, a way to do her job without being consumed by the horror of it. But in June of 1845, even her practice detachment cracked. The auction house on Broughton Street was crowded that morning. Summer was the busy season for slave sales. Planters needed additional workers for harvest, and those who'd overextended financially during the previous year often sold people to cover debts. The air inside the building was stifling, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and something else Rebecca could never quite name. The scent of fear, perhaps, or desperation she was recording. Bids in her ledger when the woman and child were brought to the platform. Rebecca had trained herself not to look too closely at the people being sold to keep her eyes on her papers, her pen moving steadily across the page. But something about this pair made her glance up. The mother was perhaps 25, dark-skinned with the muscular build of someone who'd spent years doing field work. She stood rigid on the platform, her face carefully blank, staring at some point beyond the crowd. It was a look Rebecca had seen countless times, the expression of someone who'd learned that showing emotion only made things worse. But it was the child who drew the attention of every person in that crowded room. The boy was perhaps 5 years old, small for his age, standing beside his mother with one hand clutching her worn skirt. He had pale skin, lighter than many of the planters' own children who played in Savannah's squares. His hair was orne, straight, falling across a forehead dotted with freckles. His eyes were green, bright and terrified, darting around the room as if seeking escape. If Rebecca had seen him on the street, she would have assumed he was the son of a shopkeeper or a farmer, perhaps Irish or Scottish in origin. She certainly wouldn't have guessed he was enslaved. The room went silent. The auctioneer, a man named Brennan, who'd conducted hundreds of these sales, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, adjusted his spectacles. From Thornhill Plantation, he finally announced, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The mother, Esther, aged approximately 25, strong, healthy, experienced in fieldwork and domestic service. The child name recorded as Thomas, aged 5 years, sound of body, good temperament, both for sale as a lot or separately if preferred. Starting bid, wait. The interruption came from the back of the room. A planter Rebecca didn't recognize. Tall and weathered with the suspicious expression of a man who'd been cheated before. Where's his father? The auctioneer shuffled his papers again. Not listed in the documentation, sir, as is common in such cases. Common? The planter's voice rose. Look at that child, Brennan. Look at his mother. You telling me that's a natural combination? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several planters moved closer to the platform, examining the pair with the clinical detachment they'd use when inspecting livestock. The boy pressed closer to his mother, his green eyes wide with fear. The documentation is complete and legal, gentlemen, Brennan said, his voice firm now, taking control of the situation. The child was born enslaved, properly registered with Chatham County. The mother's ownership is undisputed. Both are legal property of Thornhill Plantation, consigned here for sale by Mr. Edmund Marlowe. I have all the papers in order. But who's the father? Another voice called out. That boy looks white as chalk. Someone here knows something about Thornhill Plantation. We don't. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Rebecca watched her Uncle Edward shift uncomfortably beside the platform. She saw Brennan's jaw tighten, saw his hand grip his gavel a bit too firmly. The father's identity is not gerene to the sale, Brennan declared. Under Georgia law, the status of a child follows the condition of the mother. Esther is enslaved. Therefore, her child is enslaved regardless of paternity. That is the law, gentlemen. Now, shall we proceed with the bidding? The planter at the back of the room shook his head in disgust and walked out. Several others followed. Those who remained bid cautiously, as if uncertain what they were purchasing, as if the child's appearance made them somehow complicit in something they didn't want to acknowledge. The pair eventually sold for less than the auctioneer had expected, $400 for both. Purchased by a farmer. The pair eventually sold for less than the auctioneer had expected, $400 for both. Purchased by a farmer from Burke County who needed field hands and seemed less troubled by the boy's appearance than others. Or perhaps he saw an opportunity, Rebecca thought darkly. A child who looked like that could be employed in ways that darker-skinned enslaved people couldn't. After the sale concluded, after the crowd had dispersed and the farmer had left with his new property, Rebecca approached her uncle. He was sitting in his office drinking whiskey, even though it was barely noon, staring at nothing. Uncle Edward, she said quietly. That child, how is it possible? Her uncle looked at her with tired, bloodshot eyes. You're a clever girl, Rebecca. I think you can imagine how it's possible. But surely, she struggled for words, surely that's illegal. Surely there's some law. There's no law, Edward interrupted. "Oh, there are laws about assault, about violence. But between a master and his property," he laughed bitterly, "the law sees no crime there. The law says he can do whatever he wishes with his property, and any children born are simply more property. It's perfectly legal, Rebecca. That's the horror of it." Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. Has this happened before? Children like that from Thornhill? Edward took another drink. "This is the 4th time in the 3 years you've been working here. There were others before that when I was running the business alone. Always from Thornhill. Always the same story. White L-looking children sold with no mention of the father. Documentation all in order. Everything legal and proper." "4 times," Rebecca whispered. "That I've seen personally. Could be more that went through other auction houses in Savannah. Could be some that were sold privately, never came to public auction at all. The Marlowe are always careful to separate the children from their mothers after a few years. Send them to different sales, different counties. Makes it harder to track a pattern. Why would they do that?" Her uncle's expression darkened. "Because someone at Thornhill doesn't want anyone asking questions. Because if all these children appeared together, if people saw them all at once, even in Georgia, someone might be bothered enough to make trouble. Spread them out, sell them young before they can talk, send them far away. The pattern disappears. Each child becomes an isolated case, an affair. Maybe something people shrug off and forget." Rebecca thought about the boy, about his terrified green eyes, about how he'd clung to his mother as they were led away. What will happen to him? The same thing that happens to all enslaved children. He'll work. He'll grow up not knowing his father, not knowing the full truth of where he came from. Maybe he'll survive to see freedom someday. Maybe not, but he'll never have a normal life. Rebecca, how could he? Born into slavery looking like that with a history that no one wants to examine too closely. Uncle Edward finished his whiskey and poured another glass. "I've been in this business 30 years. I've seen every kind of cruelty, every kind of injustice. But what's happening at Thornhill Plantation is something different. It's systematic. It's deliberate. And everyone with power knows about it and does nothing because the law is on the master's side." Rebecca returned to her desk and opened her own private ledger, separate from the official records. She made a careful entry. June 1845. Mother Esther. Child Thomas, aged 5, pale skin, green eyes, auburn hair. From Thornhill Plantation, sold to Burke County. 4th such case. She underlined 4th twice. Then she closed the ledger and locked it in her desk drawer next to the small pistol her uncle insisted she keep for protection. Protection from what? She'd always wondered. Now she was beginning to understand that some threats were far too large and institutional for a pistol to defend against. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across 1,800 acres of Georgia land, bordered by the Ogeechee River on one side and thick pine forest on the other. The main house was a columned monument to wealth built on cotton and human suffering. White painted, imposing, 3 stories tall with wraparound porches and large windows that caught the breeze on humid summer evenings. The architect had been imported from Charleston in 1805 to design it for Edmund Marlowe's grandfather. The columns were cypress, each one hand-carved by enslaved craftsmen whose names were never recorded. The interior featured imported Italian marble, crystal chandeliers shipped from Boston, furniture crafted by artisans in Philadelphia. The library held over 2,000 volumes. The dining room could seat 30 guests comfortably. It was by all accounts one of the finest homes in Chatham County. Behind the main house, stretching toward the river, were the formal gardens, rose bushes, magnolia trees, carefully maintained paths lined with boxwood hedges, a fountain imported from France, a gazebo where ladies could sit in the shade and enjoy the view while enslaved workers brought refreshments. And beyond the gardens, invisible from the main house, invisible from the road, were the quarters where 247 enslaved people lived in conditions that would have shamed any civilized society. Long wooden buildings, each one housing 20 to 30 people in cramped, airless rooms. Dirt floors, no windows, walls that let in rain and cold. A single well for drinking water. Outdoor facilities that bred disease. Children sleeping on the ground. Families separated by walls so thin you could hear everything happening in the next room. This was where the wealth came from. The labor that planted, tended, picked, and processed cotton. The women who cooked, cleaned, sewed, and washed. The craftsmen who maintained buildings, equipment, and infrastructure. The domestic workers who kept the main house running like a luxury hotel. All of it documented in meticulous ledgers that reduced human beings to inventory items valued according to age, skill, health, and reproductive capacity. But there was one building that didn't quite fit the pattern. Set apart from both the main house and the quarters, hidden by a screen of live oak trees draped with Spanish moss, stood a smaller structure, a cottage really, built in 1798 by Edmund Marlowe's grandfather. It had its own well, its own vegetable garden, its own fence. The windows had shutters that could be locked from the outside. The door had a heavy bolt. Locally, among those who knew about it, it was called different things. The breeding house was most common, though never in polite company. Some of the enslaved workers called it the prison. Others called it the devil's house. Edmund Marlowe, in his private papers, referred to it as the special quarters. The cottage was approximately 30 foot by 20 foot, divided into 4 small rooms. Each room had a narrow bed, a chamber pot, a small table, and nothing else. No decoration, no comfort, no privacy. The windows were barred, the doors locked from the outside. At any given time between 1798 and 1848, anywhere from 2 to 6 women were kept in that cottage, isolated from the rest of the plantation's population. They were selected according to specific criteria. Young, between 15 and 25 years old, healthy, no physical defects, no history of difficulty or resistance, strong build, good teeth, clear eyes. The selection process was careful, deliberate, documented. Once selected, a woman would be moved from the general quarters to the cottage. She would be fed better than the field workers, more meat, fresh vegetables from the cottage garden, milk occasionally. She would be given lighter work, usually spinning or sewing, tasks that could be done while confined. She would be examined regularly by whoever served as plantation physician, ensuring she remained healthy. And Edmund Marlowe would visit regularly, predictably. When a woman became pregnant, the visits would stop. She would be monitored throughout the pregnancy, given even better food, excused from all work in the final months. When she gave birth, if the child survived, it would be taken from her within days, sometimes hours. If the child had dark skin, typical features, it might be left with the mother and both returned to the general population. But if the child had pale skin, light hair, European features, the child would be taken to the main house. It would be fed by a wet nurse, cared for by domestic workers, kept separate from its mother, and within 6 to 18 months, it would be sold, always to distant plantations, always with careful documentation showing legitimate ownership and legal transfer. The mother would recover from childbirth in the cottage, then be returned to the general population. If she'd served her purpose, or kept in the cottage if she was young enough to produce more children. This system had been in place for 50 years by 1847. 50 years of selecting women. 50 years of forced pregnancies. 50 years of taking children and selling them like livestock. 50 years of carefully maintained documentation showing that everything was legal, proper, and within the rights of a plantation owner managing his property. Daniel Prescott arrived at Thornhill Plantation in April of 1842, hired as overseer at the generous salary of $800 per year, plus housing and provisions. At 32 years old, with 7 years of experience managing agricultural operations in North Carolina, he considered it an excellent opportunity. The position had become available suddenly. The previous overseer, a man named Cullen, had left without notice in February. Edmund Marlowe had written to several plantation management services seeking a replacement, and Prescott's name had been recommended. The work seemed straightforward. Manage the cotton operation, supervise the ENS. The work seemed straightforward. Manage the cotton operation, supervise the enslaved labor force, maintain discipline, and ensure that production targets were met. Daniel Prescott had done all of that before. He prided himself on efficiency, not cruelty. He believed there was a difference, even if the system itself allowed little room for morality. Thornhill, however, began to unsettle him within weeks of his arrival. At first, it was small things, instructions that came directly from Edmund Marlowe and were not to be questioned. Certain buildings marked off-limits. Certain names never to appear in the daily reports. Prescott noticed the isolated cottage almost immediately. It sat too far from the main house to be a guest dwelling and too well maintained to be abandoned. When he asked about it, Marlowe's response was brief and final. Special quarters, not part of your responsibility. Prescott accepted that, at least on the surface. Overseers learned quickly which questions shortened their employment. But he could not help observing the movement of women to and from that place. Young women, always young, chosen quietly, transferred without explanation, returning months later thinner, hollow-eyed, sometimes carrying nothing, sometimes carrying grief so heavy it seemed to bend their spines. The plantation physician visited that cottage far more often than the quarters. Food deliveries were better there. Milk, meat, fresh vegetables. It made no sense in a system built on extracting maximum labor at minimum cost. Nothing at Thornhill was wasteful. That cottage was deliberate. By the end of his first year, Prescott had begun keeping his own mental ledger. He noted dates, absences, returns. He noticed how infants with lighter skin were never seen in the quarters. Darker babies cried in the night, were carried on their mothers' backs to the fields, grew up barefoot in the dirt. But the pale ones vanished. Taken to the main house, he was told, sold later, moved on. One evening in late summer, Prescott saw something he could not forget. A woman named Lydia was being escorted back to the quarters. She had been in the cottage for nearly a year. She walked slowly, as if every step hurt. Her arms were empty. Prescott asked where the child was. The guard shrugged. Taken care of. That night, Prescott lay awake in his small overseer's house, staring at the ceiling. He had enforced whippings before. He had ordered families separated for efficiency. He had told himself it was not his place to interfere. But this felt different. This felt organized in a way that stripped even the usual lies from the system. In Savannah, Rebecca Hartwell continued her work, but Thornhill haunted her. She began discreetly asking questions, comparing notes with clerks at other auction houses. The pattern repeated. Pale children, early sales, distant counties, always Thornhill. She added each case to her private ledger, the list growing longer, heavier. Clark Thomas Hayes, too, continued his quiet work. His private ledger filled with names, dates, fragments of lives reduced to ink. He knew better than to confront power directly. Instead, he copied, preserved, cross-referenced. He told himself that someday someone might need proof, that someday these records might matter. None of them knew each other. Not Hayes in his modest Savannah home, not Rebecca at her desk beside the auction block, not Prescott riding the fields of Thornhill at dawn. But they were bound by the same truth, circling the same horror from different distances.